On the morning of January 12, 1888, 3 men stepped onto the ice of Lake Mendota in Madison, Wisconsin, carrying a surveying tripod, a leather satchel of instruments, and a single coil of manila rope. By nightfall, all 3 had vanished. Their names were recorded in the university ledger as Henry Whitcomb, chief surveyor for the Wisconsin Geological and Natural History Survey. His assistant, Thomas Erdmann, 26 years old, recently married, and Jonas Keller, a local guide hired for his knowledge of the lake's winter conditions. The disappearance would remain unexplained for 41 days. When the answer finally came, it arrived not as revelation, but as confirmation of something several people had suspected from the beginning, and failed to say aloud. Henry Whitcomb was not a reckless man. His correspondence, preserved in the archives of the State Historical Society, reveals a cautious temperament. He double-checked measurements. He questioned assumptions. In November of 1887, he wrote to his supervisor expressing concern about the compressed timeline for the winter survey, noting that ice conditions on Mendota were notoriously variable and that local fishermen often delayed travel until late January. But the state legislature had allocated funds with a deadline. The survey was to assess potential rail routes across the southern lakes, and the appropriation expired in March. Whitcomb had 8 weeks to complete fieldwork that would normally require 12. He accepted the assignment without further protest. Thomas Erdmann left behind fewer documents. A single letter to his wife, written 2 days before departure, mentions the cold and his hope that the work would be finished quickly. He signed it, "Your faithful husband," and included a request that she not worry. Jonas Keller left no letters at all. What remains is a notation in the hiring record of the survey office: local man, familiar with ice. The winter of 1887 to 88 was unusual. December had been warm. The first serious freeze did not arrive until the final week of the year, nearly 3 weeks later than average. By early January, the ice on Lake Mendota measured between 8 and 14 inches thick, depending on location. Fishermen were already setting up shanties near the southern shore, where the depth was shallow and the ice formed earliest. But the center of the lake, where the survey line needed to cross, was deeper, colder, and subject to currents that thinned the ice unpredictably. On January 11th, Whitcomb met with Jonas Keller at the survey office on Bascom Hill. According to a brief notation in Whitcomb's field journal, Keller confirmed that the ice was holding, and that several fishing parties had crossed the lake without incident in recent days. Whitcomb asked how thick the ice was at the center. Keller's answer is not recorded. What is recorded is Whitcomb's decision, written in his own hand at the bottom of the page: "Proceed at first light. Time cannot be spared." The 3 men departed from the university boathouse at 6:45 on the morning of January 12th. The temperature was 19 degrees Fahrenheit. The sky was overcast. There was no wind. A student named Arthur Longwell, working in the biology laboratory overlooking the lake, later testified that he saw the men walking in single file across the ice, heading northeast toward the center of the lake. He described their progress as steady and unhurried. He did not see them return. By 8 o'clock, they had reached the first survey marker, a wooden stake driven into the ice approximately 1 mile from shore. Whitcomb's field journal contains a single entry from that morning, timed at 8:15 a.m. Marker 1 confirmed. Ice solid. Visibility fair. Proceeding to Marker 2. Marker 2 was located another half-mile northeast in the deepest part of the lake. They never reached it. At 4:30 that afternoon, when the men had not returned to the boathouse, the university groundskeeper notified the survey office. At 5:15, a search party assembled. 6 men, carrying lanterns and poles, walked out onto the ice following the same route Whitcomb's team had taken. They found the tripod first. It was standing upright, undisturbed, approximately 20 yards short of where Marker 2 should have been. The leather satchel was lying beside it, unopened. The coil of rope was still looped over the tripod's leg. There were no footprints leading away from the site. There was, however, a sound. One of the searchers, a groundskeeper named Emil Thorpe, later described it in his written statement as a faint creaking like timber under strain coming from beneath the ice. When they brought the lanterns closer, they saw it, a fracture line, roughly 4 inches wide, running in an irregular arc across the ice for more than 50 feet. The edges were smooth and recent. In 2 places, water had seeped up through the crack and refrozen in thin, glassy sheets. The men stepped back. They did not cross the fracture line. They marked its location with stakes and returned to shore. The search was suspended until morning. Henry Whitcomb had made his decision 30 hours earlier in the warmth of the survey office, with a deadline pressing and a guide's assurance that the ice was safe. He had not tested it himself. He had not asked for a second opinion. He had trusted speed over caution, efficiency over prudence. And once the decision was made, there had been no moment to reverse it. By the time the ice began to shift beneath them, it was already too late. The work of the Wisconsin Geological Survey in the 1880s was defined by routine. Surveyors traveled in pairs or small teams. They carried standardized instruments, transits, levels, measuring chains, and followed established protocols. Winter fieldwork was common, particularly on frozen lakes, where visibility was unobstructed and terrain was flat. Ice surveys were considered less hazardous than forest or swamp work, provided the ice was thick enough. The standard threshold, according to a manual published by the U.S. Coast and Geodetic Survey in 1885, was 12 inches of solid ice for men on foot. Anything less required additional precautions: ropes, multiple crossing points, continuous testing with an ice auger. Henry Whitcomb owned an ice auger. It was found later, stored in the equipment shed at the boathouse. He had not brought it with him. Whitcomb's career had been built on precision. He had joined the survey in 1881, shortly after completing his degree in civil engineering at the University of Wisconsin. His early assignments involved mapping railroad grades and assessing canal routes. He was promoted to chief surveyor in 1886, a position that came with increased responsibility and reduced oversight. His supervisor, Dr. Roland Irving, was based in Milwaukee and visited the Madison office infrequently. Most communication occurred by letter, often delayed by weather or postal irregularities. In December of 1887, Irving wrote to Whitcomb expressing confidence in his judgment and urging him to make the best use of available time. The letter concluded with a reminder that the legislature was unlikely to extend funding. Whitcomb replied on January 3rd, assuring Irving that the survey would proceed as planned. He did not mention the late freeze. He did not mention the variability of the ice. Thomas Erdmann had been with the survey for less than a year. His role was straightforward: carry equipment, record measurements, assist with setup and breakdown. He was not expected to make decisions. His training had been minimal: 2 weeks of fieldwork under Whitcomb's supervision, followed by a series of routine assignments along established routes. He had never worked on ice before. In his letter to his wife, written on January 10th, he described the upcoming survey as simple enough work and expressed mild concern about the cold. He mentioned that Whitcomb had hired a local man who knows the lake well, which seemed to reassure him. He did not ask why they were crossing in early January instead of waiting for colder weather. He did not ask to see the ice thickness measurements. He simply trusted that the decision had been made responsibly. Jonas Keller was 43 years old, a fisherman and occasional guide who had lived in Madison for more than 20 years. He knew Lake Mendota as well as anyone. He had crossed it hundreds of times, in every season, under every condition. He understood how the ice formed, where it thinned, how wind and current affected its stability. But he also understood something else. He was being paid to confirm what Whitcomb wanted to hear. When Whitcomb asked if the ice was safe, Keller said yes. He did not specify where it was safe. He did not mention that the center of the lake was always the last to freeze and the first to weaken. He did not explain that 8 inches of ice might hold a man one day and break beneath him the next, depending on temperature, wind, and the movement of water below. He said the ice was holding. He said fishing parties had crossed without incident. Both statements were true. Neither was complete. On the evening of January 11th, Keller returned to his boarding house on West Main Street and ate dinner with the landlord, a man named Samuel Drexel. Drexel later recalled that Keller seemed quiet, preoccupied. When asked about the next day's work, Keller said only that he was guiding a survey crew across the lake and that it would be a long walk. Drexel asked if the ice was safe. Keller hesitated. Then he said, "Safe enough." It was the only reservation he expressed aloud. The warning signs were subtle, but they existed. On January 9th, a local fisherman named Otto Gunderson reported hearing cracking sounds near the center of the lake. He moved his shanty closer to shore and advised others to do the same. His account was noted in the Madison Democrat newspaper on January 11th, buried on page 4 beneath an advertisement for patent medicine. Whitcomb did not subscribe to the Democrat. He read the Wisconsin State Journal, which carried no mention of ice conditions that week. On January 10th, the temperature rose briefly to 34 degrees, then dropped again overnight. The thaw-freeze cycle weakened the ice in localized areas, particularly where the lake was deepest. Whitcomb noted the temperature change in his field journal but drew no conclusions from it. On the morning of January 12th, Emil Thorpe, the groundskeeper, observed that the ice near the boathouse looked gray and wet in places. He mentioned it to Whitcomb in passing. Whitcomb thanked him and continued loading equipment. There was no single moment when the decision became irreversible. It accumulated slowly across days and assumptions. The late freeze, the deadline, the guide's assurance, the absence of an auger, the trust in routine. By the time the three men stepped onto the ice, the outcome was already written in factors they had not fully considered. They walked steadily, without hesitation, toward the center of the lake, and the ice, which had been holding, began to yield. The reconstruction of what happened between 8:15 and 9:30 on the morning of January 12, 1888, relies on indirect evidence. No witnesses observed the men after Arthur Longwell lost sight of them from the biology laboratory. No one heard calls for help. The search party found no written notes beyond Whitcomb's final journal entry. What remains is the physical evidence, the position of the tripod, the fracture line, the undisturbed satchel and rope, and beneath it, testimony from two sources that emerged weeks later. The first source was a fisherman named Karl Rademacher. On the afternoon of January 12th, Rademacher had been working on the eastern shore of the lake, approximately a mile and a half from where the survey crew disappeared. He was mending a net inside his shanty when shortly before 9 o'clock, he heard what he described as a deep muffled crack, followed by several smaller ones. He stepped outside. The air was still. The sound had come from the direction of the lake's center, where the ice was darkest. Rademacher watched for a moment, saw nothing unusual, and returned to his work. He did not report the sound until January 15th, after news of the disappearance had spread through Madison. By then, 3 days had passed. His account was recorded by a county deputy, but was not considered decisive. The second source was a set of measurements taken by the search party on the evening of January 12th. Using poles and weighted lines, the searchers probed the ice on both sides of the fracture line. North of the crack, the ice measured 14 inches thick. South of it, where the lake deepened, the ice measured 9 inches. At the point closest to where the tripod stood, the ice measured 6 inches. 6 inches was not enough. Not for 3 men carrying equipment. Not for the accumulated weight of motion and pressure. Not for ice that had formed late and unevenly, weakened by a brief thaw and subjected to the slow, invisible currents of a deep lake. The fracture had been inevitable. The only variable was when it would occur. Whitcomb's final journal entry, written at 8:15 a.m., contains no indication of concern. Marker 1 confirmed, ice solid, visibility fair, proceeding to marker 2. The handwriting is steady. The phrasing is routine. There is no evidence of hesitation. It is possible that Whitcomb tested the ice at marker 1 and found it acceptable. It is possible that he assumed the conditions would remain consistent as they moved deeper. It is also possible that he did not test it at all. The absence of the auger suggests the latter. If Whitcomb had drilled even a single test hole between marker 1 and marker 2, he would have discovered that the ice was thinning rapidly. He would have seen water welling up through the hole. He would have had the information necessary to turn back. But there is no evidence that he stopped. The tripod was found upright, in position, as if they had been preparing to set up for a measurement. The satchel was unopened, its brass clasps still fastened. Whatever happened, it happened suddenly. The most plausible reconstruction is this. The three men reached the vicinity of marker 2 sometime between 8:30 and 9 o'clock. Whitcomb, walking in front, would have selected the setup location and signaled Erdmann and Keller to stop. Erdmann would have set down the satchel. Keller would have begun uncoiling the rope for the marker stake. The ice beneath them was already compromised. The fracture likely began as a hairline crack, invisible under snow and surface frost. The weight of three men standing in proximity, roughly 500 pounds combined, concentrated the stress. The crack widened. Water began seeping upward into the fissure, and then, in a span of seconds, the ice gave way. Drowning in frigid water is not dramatic. The cold constricts the lungs. The body's shock response, gasping, thrashing, accelerates heat loss and exhaustion. In water just above freezing, most people lose the ability to coordinate movement within 2 to 3 minutes. Unconsciousness follows shortly after. If the men went through the ice together, they would have had no time to react effectively. The rope was still coiled. The satchel was unopened. There is no evidence that anyone attempted to crawl back onto the ice or call for help. The lake at that location was 63 feet deep. The current, moving slowly beneath the ice, would have carried the bodies away from the fracture point. The silence that followed was absolute. No one on shore heard the ice break. No one saw the men disappear. The fracture line itself refroze partially within hours, obscuring the exact point of failure. When the search party arrived that evening, they found a scene that looked almost normal. The tripod stood waiting. The satchel lay neatly beside it. The only anomaly was the absence of footprints leading away and the faint, ominous creaking of stressed ice. Emil Thorpe, kneeling beside the fracture line with a lantern, later described the sound as the lake settling, like a building cooling after a fire. It was not settling. It was still breaking. If Henry Whitcomb had waited one more week, the ice would have thickened to 15 inches across the entire lake. If he had brought the auger, he would have discovered the danger before reaching the center. If he had hired a second guide, someone might have advised caution. If Jonas Keller had spoken more plainly about the risks, Whitcomb might have reconsidered. But Whitcomb was under pressure. Keller was being paid to facilitate, not obstruct. Erdmann trusted his superior, and the ice, for 800 yards, had held. The decision was made not in a single moment, but across a series of small concessions to urgency. By the time Whitcomb wrote, proceeding to marker 2, the outcome was already determined. At 9:30 on the morning of January 12th, the surface of Lake Mendota was smooth and undisturbed. 3 men were gone. The tripod remained, a monument to the last thing they had intended to do. The search for Henry Whitcomb, Thomas Erdmann, and Jonas Keller continued for 6 days. On January 13th, the county sheriff organized a systematic effort involving more than 20 volunteers. They marked the fracture line with stakes and began probing the surrounding ice with poles. The work was slow and hazardous. Twice, searchers felt the ice shift beneath them and retreated. By January 14th, the search had expanded to include the shoreline. Teams walked the perimeter of the lake, checking for any sign that the men had reached land. They found nothing. On January 15th, Karl Rademacher came forward with his account of hearing the ice crack. His testimony shifted the focus of the search back to the fracture site, but conditions made further probing impossible. The temperature had dropped to 8 degrees, and new ice had formed over the open water, creating a deceptive surface that could not support weight. On January 18th, the search was officially suspended. Dr. Roland Irving, Whitcomb's supervisor, traveled to Madison from Milwaukee and reviewed the evidence. He concluded, in a brief statement to the press, that the men had likely perished due to structural failure of the ice. and that recovery would have to wait until spring thaw. The families were notified. There was no further official action. Thomas Erdmann's wife, Anna, arrived in Madison on January 20th. She met with university officials and requested access to her husband's belongings. She was given his overcoat, his field notebook, largely blank, and the letter he had written to her 2 days before his death. She asked whether the ice had been tested before the men departed. The question was referred to Dr. Irving, who replied that ice conditions were assessed by the hired guide and deemed acceptable. Anna Erdmann asked who the guide was. She was told his name was Jonas Keller and that he had also perished. She asked no further questions. She returned to Milwaukee the following day and did not speak publicly about the incident again. Henry Whitcomb's parents, both in their 70s, requested a formal inquiry. The request was reviewed by the university administration and declined on the grounds that the disappearance was an act of nature, not negligence. The decision was based in part on testimony from Emil Thorpe and other university employees, all of whom confirmed that Whitcomb had been an experienced and cautious surveyor. No one mentioned the missing auger. No one discussed the compressed timeline or the legislative deadline. The narrative that emerged in the Madison press was simple. 3 men had ventured onto ice that appeared safe and had been caught by an unpredictable fracture. It was a tragedy, but not a preventable one. Whitcomb's field journal, containing his final entry, was filed in the survey archives and was not examined again for more than 50 years. Jonas Keller had no family in Madison. A cousin, living in Milwaukee, claimed his body when it was eventually recovered and arranged for burial. There was no obituary, no public statement. Keller's role in the incident was noted only in passing, as the local guide. Samuel Drexel, Keller's landlord, was interviewed briefly by a reporter from the Wisconsin State Journal. He mentioned that Keller had seemed uneasy the night before the survey, but had not refused the work. When asked why Keller would proceed if he had doubts, Drexel offered a single sentence that was not included in the published article. "A man needs to work." The bodies were not recovered until late February. On February 22nd, a warm spell caused partial thawing along the southern edge of the lake. A fisherman reported seeing something dark beneath the ice near Picnic Point, roughly a mile southwest of the fracture site. A recovery team assembled the following day. Using saws and pike poles, they cut through the ice and retrieved the first body. It was identified through clothing and personal effects as Thomas Erdmann. Henry Whitcomb's body was found 2 days later, approximately 300 yards from Erdmann's. Jonas Keller's body was located on February 28th, another quarter-mile south. All 3 had been carried by the current, slowly, across the lake bed. The autopsies were brief. Cause of death in all 3 cases was listed as drowning due to cold water immersion. There were no signs of struggle, no broken bones, no evidence of prolonged survival. The coroner estimated that death had occurred within 5 to 8 minutes of entering the water. The bodies were released to their families. Henry Whitcomb was buried in Madison on March 3rd. Thomas Erdmann was buried in Milwaukee on March 5th. Jonas Keller was buried in an unmarked grave in a municipal cemetery. The Wisconsin Geological Survey resumed operations in April. The Lake Survey was reassigned to a different team, who completed the work in late January of 1889, using augmented safety protocols and drilling test holes every 50 yards. The final report made no mention of the previous year's attempt. In the decades that followed, Lake Mendota claimed other lives. Ice fishermen, skaters, and occasional travelers continued to misjudge conditions. But none of those incidents generated the same scrutiny because none involved professional surveyors acting under institutional authority. The lesson, if there was one, remained unwritten. Speed had seemed necessary. The ice had seemed solid. The guide had said it was safe. And 3 men, trusting in competence and routine, had walked to the center of the lake and disappeared. The fracture line refroze. The tripod was removed. The season turned. By summer, there was nothing left to mark the spot. In 1929, 41 years after the disappearance, a historian named Margaret Hollis began compiling a comprehensive record of drownings in Wisconsin's inland lakes. Her research was intended for a public safety initiative sponsored by the State Department of Natural Resources. She reviewed coroner's reports, newspaper archives, and institutional records dating back to the 1870s. It was during this process that she encountered the case of Whitcomb, Erdmann, and Keller. Hollis was struck by the absence of follow-up. No formal inquiry, no published findings, no policy changes within the Geological Survey. The incident had been documented, filed, and quietly forgotten. She requested access to the survey's archives and was granted permission to review Whitcomb's field journals. What she found was a single entry, written in steady handwriting less than 2 hours before his death. Marker 1 confirmed. Ice solid. Visibility fair. Proceeding to Marker 2. Hollis interviewed several elderly residents of Madison who remembered the incident. 1. A former university groundskeeper named Arthur Longwell, the same man who had seen the survey crew depart, recalled standing at the window of the biology laboratory and watching 3 figures move across the ice. He described them as walking, without hesitation, in a straight line. When asked whether he had noticed anything unusual, Longwell said no. They looked, he said, like men who knew what they were doing. In her final report, Hollis devoted 3 pages to the Lake Mendota disappearance. She noted the unusually late freeze, the compressed timeline, the absence of an ice auger, the guide's incomplete assessment, the lack of institutional oversight. She concluded with a single paragraph. The deaths of Whitcomb, Erdmann, and Keller were not the result of recklessness or ignorance. They were the result of cumulative misjudgment operating within a framework of professional expectation. Each man trusted that the necessary precautions had been taken. None verified that trust. The ice did not fail unexpectedly. It failed precisely as it should have, given the conditions. What failed was the collective assumption that speed and routine could substitute for caution. The report was published in 1930 and distributed to state agencies. It prompted minor revisions to fieldwork protocols within the Department of Natural Resources, including mandatory ice thickness testing for all winter surveys. The changes were implemented quietly, without acknowledgement of the 1888 incident. Margaret Hollis died in 1947. Her papers were donated to the Wisconsin Historical Society, where they remain accessible to researchers. Henry Whitcomb's field journals are stored in the same archive, in a file labeled Geological Survey, Field Notes, 1881-1888. The final entry remains legible. In 1952, the University of Wisconsin installed a historical marker near the site of the old boathouse, commemorating the development of the Geological Survey. It makes no mention of the 3 men who disappeared. Lake Mendota froze and thawed year after year. Fishermen continued to cross it. Skaters traced patterns on its surface. Students walked its shores. The spot where Whitcomb, Erdmann, and Keller went through the ice is unmarked. The coordinates, recorded in the search party's notes, place it roughly 300 yards northeast of Picnic Point in water 63 feet deep. On clear winter mornings, when the ice is thick and the surface is smooth, people still cross the lake without hesitation. Most do not know the ice's history. Most do not think to ask. The decision Henry Whitcomb made on the morning of January 12, 1888, was not extraordinary. It was ordinary. It was the kind of decision made every day by competent professionals operating under pressure, relying on partial information, trusting in experience and the assurances of others. It was a decision that, in different conditions, might have led to nothing more than a successful survey and a timely report. But conditions were not different. The ice was thin. The timeline was compressed. The auger was in the shed. And 3 men, believing they were acting reasonably, walked forward into a situation that offered no second chances. There is a photograph taken in 1887 of Henry Whitcomb standing beside a surveying transit. He is wearing a dark coat and a wide-brimmed hat. His expression is serious, professional. Behind him, barely visible, is the shoreline of a lake. It is not labeled, but it may be Mendota. The photograph is stored in the university archives in a folder marked Survey Personnel 1880s. No one looks at it anymore. What remains in the end is a simple truth. They thought speed would save them. They thought the ice was solid. They thought the guide knew what he was saying. They thought wrong. And the lake, indifferent and patient, closed over them without sound.